Awesome. Well, thank you so much. My name is Eleanor Hart. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Associate Director of Academic Technology and Inclusive Design in the IT department at Portland State University. I wanted to host this session today, not because I'm a particular expert in boundary setting, but because I've been doing a lot of work in this area over the last couple of years to get myself into a happier place at work. As I've talked to more and more folks about this topic, I've come to realize that there's a real commonality around the situations in which boundary setting and holding is particularly challenging amongst folks whose gender identity tends more towards the feminine than the masculine. Just talking to my friends and colleagues about boundaries has been incredibly helpful for me in my journey. And so the primary goal of today's session is going to be to talk to each other about this oddly challenging topic.
And I'm Michelle Bromley. I manage the digital accessibility and content team for the Office of Information Technology at Portland State. Similar to Eleanor's experience and interest in this topic, mine arises from my own experience as a woman, spouse, mom, friend, colleague, and boss, because I am all of these things in the workplace. I don't leave any part of me at home. My confidence or lack of confidence in who I am speaks to respect or space in a conversation that I think I deserve. This presentation isn't going to cover every kind of boundary you might need to protect yourself. It won't offer all of the answers, but it will offer a starting point. This is a conversation that we're starting together in order to prompt an ongoing conversation with yourself. Before we jump in, we do want to direct your attention to a link we've shared in the chat, bit.ly/gain in all capitals, -6 feet, and the first letter of 6 and feet is capitalized. This should redirect you to an accessible copy of our slide content. We want to make sure folks have access to our content for purposes of following along with adaptive technology as necessary.
All right, so let's take on the introduction as a group. If you could think about the question, what are boundaries and why are they important? This is such a packed question. We have a few ideas ourselves, but we're going to talk more about those today, but we'd really like to hear from y'all. What are some general or specific boundaries that have been or might be becoming really important to you in the workplace, either post-pandemic, or maybe they've always been important, or maybe it's something you've just been thinking about recently. Please feel free to raise your hand and unmute or add some ideas to the chat and we can read those out loud. Okay. So we can just share what we have. Let's see. Oh, Sarah, thank you for sharing. Being okay with saying no. Yes, it's been hard. Sarah says it's been hard for her. I feel like I might miss out on an opportunity. It is a boundary I'm struggling with. Thank you for sharing.
And Carla shares family life, self-care, work, and studies overlapping. Absolutely. No, these are really good. They're in alignment with some of the ones we're talking about today. Looks like we've got another one, Eleanor.
Yeah, Rachel says the way in which I insist on acknowledgement of my own humanity in my workplace. Yes.
Absolutely. Annalise says a limit of what you are willing to entertain or accept. Wow, that is great.
Sarah brings up a good point. Also, I'm a person with no compartments. My work and personal life are all parts of me, and it's hard to manage boundaries within that type of personality. A friend of mine said at the start of the pandemic that her whole concept of work-life balance just stopped existing, that everything became so intertwined that she just had this mixture that she couldn't separate out the pieces. I totally hear that. Yeah.
Well, these were great. And every one of these is really meaningful because it's meaningful to you. It's also meaningful to the rest of us. We've got one more challenge of identifying boundaries from Erica about space while being in person on campus due to their admin support position, while others are not required to be present. That is tough. And this conversation was really the goal of this presentation, to get you all thinking about the space, respect, and autonomy that you deserve in the workplace. So I guess that's it. We're done. We've done our job. I'm just kidding. Eleanor and I have a few ideas of our own that we wanted to share with you regarding what a boundary is to us. And again, as Eleanor shared, we're not experts. This is our personal experience and what we've been engaging in conversation about with each other and our colleagues for a while now. So to us, a boundary is a limit you set for yourself and sometimes for others on your behalf. Not because it's your right to regulate the people around you, but it is your right to protect yourself from the people and circumstances around you, and to be clear with others when they're going too far and asking too much of you. You only have so much to pour out of yourself without allowing yourself the space to refill. There's only so much of you. And it's a lot and it's beautiful, but it deserves protecting so that you have the space to choose to pour out when you want to and where. The space to give of yourself where it matters most to you and when. An example of a limit you set for yourself in the workplace might be that you leave by 5:30 p.m. every day and don't engage with work again until you wake up in the morning. Boundaries are also an edge of self, the line between you and the people around you. It's how much you choose to engage with the emotions and situations of those around you. An example of edge of self might be the extent to which you let other people's moods affect you. If your colleague is cranky, does it make you cranky? Do you try to make them uncranky? If so, why? Do you try to change their mood because you want to help them, or because it's uncomfortable for you to be around their bad mood? Finally, on this first list, a boundary is a rule to which you hold yourself accountable. This can be hard. Getting totally real, alcoholism runs in my family. I have clear rules I've set for myself regarding when I drink, how much I drink, and who I trust to keep my company when I am drinking. That can affect social gatherings and friendships with work colleagues. I have no obligation to say yes to spending time with my colleagues outside of work or to drink with them. I can choose to do so as long as I adhere to the rules I've set for myself around drinking, but that's my choice. It's a boundary I've set for myself to protect myself. We do have one more. Boundaries are sometimes external rules that keep us safe. This is really important to remember, and I think it's something sometimes that we forget. There are often institutional boundaries and rules, or at least strong recommendations, meant to make the workplace safer and more inclusive, meant to save us from having to enforce our personal boundaries on others. But there are rules that are sometimes forgotten, and it's important to be aware of the boundaries set by your workplace. They're there to protect you, and it's okay to remind people of them, or to speak to someone of authority in whom you trust, so that they can remind people of them.
Great. So we're going to go through sort of a workplace boundaries 101 now. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list of the types of boundaries or in any way a masterclass in boundary setting. Instead, this part of the session is only meant to give us shared language to use to talk about boundaries, and hopefully some engagement tools to help us better understand what and where our own boundaries are. So digging in a little bit, we've defined generally what a boundary is. Now we're going to dig deeper with 3 specific types of workplace specific boundaries. These resonate with me and Michelle. You'll see this language if you are reading about boundary setting in the workplace. These are common terms you'll see, but there's also a lot of other types of boundaries out there. So I don't want to in any way imply that this is exhaustive. These are 3 really good ones to start with. Physical, mental, and emotional. So we're going to start with physical. Physical boundaries, very loosely, as defined as what you do with your body and how you use your time, how you distribute your time. So the first one is probably the easiest type to recognize. Do you hug? Do you shake hands? Do you wave at someone when you see them? Do you nod? How do you acknowledge somebody else's presence? If someone hugs you without permission or puts their hand on your shoulder while they're explaining something to you and that makes you uncomfortable, then your physical boundaries have been crossed. These are often the easiest to notice, but that doesn't mean they're the easiest to enforce. Personal story of mine is that I used to work with someone who was a hugger, and I never really wanted to hug him, but everyone at work was like, oh, that's just so-and-so. He's such a softie. That's just how he is. Don't worry about it. And it wasn't until I started talking to people about these work boundaries that I kind of realized that's a really busted narrative. Like it hadn't really occurred to me before. He was just sort of the grandpa figure in the department. But now I still see him. He doesn't work here anymore, but I still like physically keep furniture or something between us when he's around because I don't want to be put in that situation again. So that's one that can be kind of weird, especially in the workplace, but really being clear about like how you engage physically with other people. This is one Michelle brought up when we were first going over the list, but do you work extra hours? And under what circumstances do you work extra hours? Yeah, aggressive hugger. Yeah, there's a whole category of folks who aggressive hugger is a perfect description. So about working extra hours, this one's really tough, especially in higher education. We often have jobs that require extra hours, and it's really easy for us to think, oh, this is my job, I have to do it. But many jobs also don't really have a clear definition of what done means. So we really have to create that limit for ourselves. It's going to look different for everyone, but it's important to have that limit because a lot of jobs, especially in higher education, there's a near infinite amount of work you could do. So what do you prioritize? What deadlines do you let slide? What committees do you resign from to free up your work hours so that you don't have to answer emails from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m.? Only you can answer these questions. There are no right or wrong answers, but it's important to reflect on these questions so that you can have clear answers for yourself before someone asks you to take on more, or if you're like me, before you start a new project yourself. And know really like, what are you getting into? And this last one, do you plan social gatherings or take notes in meetings? This one's very much a gender stereotype that I really feel like we can't have this conversation without addressing. The emotional labor of planning social gatherings and the secretarial labor of taking notes are 2 examples of traditionally feminine labor that somehow keeps getting disproportionately distributed onto the more feminine presenting folks in the workplace. This isn't bad if you enjoy party planning or you enjoy taking notes. I personally love taking notes during complicated conversations because it helps me process information and helps me track the conversation. So we're not saying that you shouldn't do this labor or that if you do this labor, you somehow have weak boundaries, just rather that it's important to scrutinize the work that tends to fall on you by default and decide whether you're comfortable with it or not. Often doing this type of labor means not doing something else or working late hours to get that other work done. Are you okay with that? If so, that's great. If not, then re-examining a boundary and figuring out how to have a conversation with someone to sort of inch that in a different direction. Let's see. Okay. We've got some really good comments in the chat. We didn't really build this into the presentation, but I really want to bring up something Jessica just said. I work with a professor who does not allow female identifying students to be the note takers in their course group meetings. It really forces the students to question assumptions around the gendered assumptions we make about roles. I think that's a really interesting way of demonstrating boundaries on behalf of someone else. I think that raises a lot of very interesting questions. So thank you for sharing that, Jessica.
So next we have mental boundaries. And this involves more than just emotional labor. Like Eleanor said, we'll be talking about emotional boundaries next. We're talking about the conversations you have with others in the workplace that both let them into your personal life and invite you into theirs. Topics of conversation are a choice. Tone is telling regarding how comfortable you and your colleagues are in sharing the non-work side of their lives. Space in a conversation is critical. What space do you need? What space do you take? You have no obligation to be friends with your coworkers. There's also no problem with being friends with your coworkers. Eleanor is one of my closest and dearest friends, but she's also now my boss. So we're both building new boundaries to protect ourselves, our professional relationship, and our friendship. Again, there is nothing wrong with being friends with your coworkers as long as you're cognizant of your own boundaries and receptive to and respectful of theirs. So are you comfortable discussing politics, religion, or sports in the workplace? There isn't a wrong answer to this question. If you're not comfortable with these topics, you don't have to discuss them and you can set that boundary. There also may be boundaries within those conversations. You're comfortable talking about those topics, but there might be a point at which it is time to gracefully remove yourself from the conversation. Do you share your birth date with others? You all may have seen, heard, or otherwise been made aware of a story in the news lately where someone asked specifically that their birthday not be celebrated in the workplace, and their wishes were not respected, resulting in a mental health crisis and ultimately a loss of employment. It was a rough situation, but some people love birthdays and some people don't. Some people enjoy the attention and others don't. For some, the attention can be harmful. This is a boundary you can choose to set for yourself and one you should respect for others. Are you protective of your space in a conversation? This is a really interesting concept that Eleanor and I spent some time on. And we're thinking of space in a conversation about the way in which we participate in both informal conversations and the discussions we have in meetings. These have a lot to do with how we hold our mental boundaries. Are you comfortable diving into a heated debate in which folks are talking over each other? Some of this can have a lot to do with your household growing up and how your family interacted with each other. Do you prefer a more orderly conversation in which people take turns talking, or there's even a facilitator who holds space for everyone to speak in turn? How do you feel when someone interrupts you? Understanding how you prefer to participate in conversation helps you develop mechanisms for effective participation. This is something that in my own personal life, I realized that I was raised very differently from my now partner. And when I brought him home for the first time to engage with my just very loud, raucous Irish family who interrupts, if that's how we talk, is just interrupting. We talk over each other. Whoever is talking loudest, that's the point that comes across in the conversation. And when we left dinner, he was so uncomfortable and he was like, "Are they always that angry?" And I had to explain that nobody was actually angry. That's just how we talked to each other. And it's taken about 10 years, but he's still kind of developing like, okay, like I understand where my boundaries are and how I'm going to participate or not participate in this conversation. An example of holding your space in a work conversation where the patterns and the structure are maybe uncomfortable to you, you don't know how to interject, people are talking all over each other, would be maybe raising your hand to speak. and drawing some physical attention to, I have something to say and I need some space. It's a simple way of showing that you prefer clearly defined space to speak, and it invites other folks to make that space for you. I've seen in work conversations before where that happens. You've got some extroverted external processors in the room, and everybody is saying all the things that they want to say. And then someone raises their hand, and it does change the space. And folks go, "Oh, we're doing that. Okay, yeah, we can do that." And the external processors are like, "Right, okay, I'll raise my hand," several times. I say that as an external processor.
And the last category of boundaries we're going to talk about today are emotional boundaries. So these are similar to mental boundaries, but they constitute their own category because of the critical role that empathy plays in our human experience. This is especially for feminine identifying folks who are often expected and conditioned to be more in tune with other people's emotions. And often they're even expected to shoulder the burden of other people's emotions. Emotional boundaries refers to the interactions or interconnectedness between your emotions and the people around you. So some questions to ask to sort of try to identify where your boundaries are, where your emotional boundaries are you comfortable around other people's anger? There's no right or wrong answer to this question. You're going to hear us say that a lot. I'm sorry if that's getting repetitive, but it is important that you know the answer so that you can know when to step away if someone around you is escalating or someone is coming in hot to a conversation. I'm specifically calling out anger here because for many people, another person's anger can be triggering. For me personally, it took me a really long time to realize that when men specifically display anger around me through yelling, I feel physically unsafe and my reaction is to just shut down. Understanding this, I'm now able to interject when someone starts to raise their voice around me and say, if you want to continue this conversation, you need to lower your voice. Or what usually I say is, don't yell at me. But it's very firm, it's very clear. And however it comes out, my goal is to say this before I get that feeling in my chest that I know is the indication of a really unnecessary cortisol rush. It protects me from the discomfort, but it also allows us to continue our conversation. This conversation would otherwise be completely shut down if I have that reaction that I know is coming, because intellectually, my brain literally would not be able to process information. My prefrontal cortex would not be part of the conversation anymore. The flip side of that is the contagiousness of other people's emotions. So giddiness is an example. If someone's really excited or happy about something, do you start feeling that excitement, even if it has nothing to do with you? What about their grouchiness or crankiness? The answer to these questions help understand how porous your boundaries are. Again, no right or wrong answer. It's just a moment of reflection. So there's a difference between being aware of someone else's mood and being affected by somebody else's mood. You can absolutely notice, wow, my boss is really grouchy today. Or you can actually feel that grouchiness after you have a conversation with them. And maybe then you realize a few minutes later that now you're actually grouchy. If you get swept up in other people's moods, then that just means you may need to take a little bit extra self-care when you're around people who are in those heightened states. Respecting that and making space for your self-care is a critical part of managing your emotional boundaries. You might reflect on the answers to these questions and find yourself wishing you had more or less porous boundaries. Relocating your boundaries isn't easy, especially emotional boundaries, at least that's true for me, but it is something that we can all practice and move the needle over time if we want to. Relocating an emotional boundary can be exhausting, but it can also be a really empowering experience. And the last question of this exercise is, can you sit with someone who is grieving? Grief is another example of an emotion that many of us are uncomfortable around. Understanding how you relate to others who are experiencing extreme emotions such as grief help you to both protect yourself from becoming overwhelmed by their emotions and actually help you show up for other people around you and be more supportive. There's no judgment in any of these questions. They're simply for self-reflection. The rigidity or porousness of your boundaries, emotional, mental, physical, it has no inherent value. It's simply a data point. And that data point helps us identify ways in which we can take care of ourselves more effectively.
So, what are the signs of boundary violation? There are cues that our body sends us that a boundary has been crossed. Eleanor gave a personal example when someone is yelling in a conflict situation where you might feel a physical reaction. Many folks learn to ignore the short-term cues to avoid rocking the boat or making other people uncomfortable. But if we ignore the short-term cues for too long, then we start experiencing some long-term cues. Here are a couple of examples of short-term cues: discomfort, resentment, anxiety, guilt. Long-term, burnout. Show of digital hands or reactions. How many of you are familiar with burnout? All right, see some folks so far. Other long-term cues: avoidance, withdrawal, and even explosive confrontation. When the discomfort, resentment, or anxiety have festered for so long that you can't handle it anymore. So, how do we protect ourselves from boundary violations like these? Protecting self means reestablishing. Oh, I'm so sorry. Looks like someone said the slide is still on the emotional one. Is anybody else seeing that?
Yeah.
That is interesting on my end.
You could try unsharing and resharing. Oh,
yeah,
sure.
that's what I was thinking. Oh, now we're at reestablishing our boundaries.
Okay, let me go back a slide because it sounds like we missed the signs of boundary violation. So I just want to make sure to put that up on the screen for those who are following along visually.
Yes, we
And
can
so
see that.
that was short-term cues for boundary violation: discomfort, resentment, anxiety, and guilt. And long-term: burnout, avoidance, withdrawal, and sometimes explosive confrontation. So we're going to start talking about how we protect ourselves from boundary violations like these. Protecting self means sometimes reestablishing our boundaries if we already had them, or maybe establishing boundaries in the first place if it's not a topic on which we've reflected in the past.
All right, so any of you who are familiar with Brene Brown are going to recognize this quote, but it's one of my favorites, and that's "clear is kind." And I think it applies really beautifully to the boundary setting process. Being clear is a kindness both to yourself and to others. No one knows your boundaries until you articulate them or show them. And so there's a couple different ways that we do this. The first one is communication. Communicating a boundary can be in the moment or it can be after the fact. You can do this verbally in a face-to-face conversation or over Zoom, or you can write it out in an email or a Slack message. It can even be non-linguistic, so body language to show discomfort in a situation. Non-linguistic communication is a little bit less desirable often because it leaves room for interpretation. But sometimes it's the only way that we feel that we can actually communicate about a boundary that's been crossed. So here are some loose guidelines for communicating boundaries to folks. The first is focus on the rule, not the reason. So for example, you can say, I don't participate in conversations about religion, and I'm going to ask that you refrain from talking about religion in front of me. That's a rule. It's simple. You're not explaining yourself. You don't have to. It's a very reasonable request. You might have a complicated reason behind it. Maybe you were made fun of in elementary school and it can be really triggering. Or you might have a pretty simple reason behind it. You might have a background in theology and you know you're going to end up in a 3-hour conversation with someone. It doesn't matter. From the perspective of the boundary, it's the same. I don't want to talk about this. If you feel safe, you absolutely can share the reason. I'm in no way saying that you are obligated not to share the reason or that it's inappropriate to share the reason you have a boundary. And a personal example of mine would be a few months ago, I shared some really personal information with a few folks on my team about a PTSD diagnosis I had because I really needed them to avoid certain topics during a difficult time for me. In the moment, that really helped me. It helped me communicate why I was asking for what I was asking for. And it also helped the folks that I was asking that of to understand why I was asking. Again, I didn't actually need to share that, but it made it a lot easier for us to have a conversation about what I needed and how they could support me. And I felt safe doing so. A next loose guideline is to try to avoid judgment statements. Value judgments can help us feel justified in setting our boundaries. But again, you don't need to justify your boundary. And often the justification opens up space to have debate about whether or not a boundary is reasonable. An example of a request that might be paired with a judgment is don't curse. Cursing makes you sound dumb. I've heard this a lot. Versus I'm uncomfortable when you use those words around me. Please don't. Exact same request, exact same boundary. One of those you can start a debate with. The other one is I'm uncomfortable, please stop. And that's a very reasonable request. And finally, the last one on here is to accept other people's limitations. Some folks are chronic boundary violators. The aggressive hugger, as described earlier, would be someone who's absolutely a chronic boundary violator. It's not your job to teach them how to respect people's boundaries. In fact, not taking on the responsibility to teach them that is a form of boundary. Some folks might try to debate your boundaries or argue with you because they're not ready to accept them. You don't have to engage with that. If they continue to push, if they continue to violate your boundaries, then it's time to move on to demonstrating your boundaries. So demonstration is another form of communication, but it's more action-oriented. So this is how you can reinforce a boundary that you have stated or show a boundary that you're not comfortable talking about out loud. So the first bullet point on here is get help. And this is one that I really want to acknowledge, especially in workplace settings. Getting help can be a very clear and powerful way of demonstrating a boundary. If you've made clear what your boundary is and the other person continues to ignore it, talk to someone about that. In some situations, you might go right to support resources and not engage with that person at all. HR, your supervisor, their supervisor can all be really good resources. If the boundary violation is egregious or if it triggers you in ways that makes it difficult to communicate, jump right to getting help. That's totally fine. It's actually a really nice thing about the workplace and talking about boundaries and context of the workplace is that there are often codes of conduct or folks who formally have this referee role who are expected to step in when boundary violations occur. Getting help can be asking for advice. Maybe you're not asking someone else to step in, but you're talking to someone you trust about how to more effectively enforce your boundaries. I have been doing this a lot recently. I have been asking colleagues, hey, how do you manage this situation? Or what do you do when so-and-so does that? It can also be fully passing the communication responsibility on to another person like HR or your supervisor. Sarah shares that boundaries in the workplace are easier. Boundaries with my 2-year-old, non-existent. That's a whole other session that I would love to host with someone sometime, or at least go to. Other forms of demonstrating a boundary can be walking away from a conversation. This might also mean leaving a Zoom meeting or not responding to a chat message. It's non-engagement. You might take a pause by delaying a response to your email or a chat, or just sitting quietly in a conversation until you've had time to process information. And then finally, and this one I think is really important and one that I personally struggle with a lot, which is redirecting someone who is in need of support to appropriate resources. This is a really beautiful way to demonstrate boundaries and support someone who's going through something. I work in IT, so my first example is sending someone to the help desk who always comes to you to ask for computer support, giving someone the email address of your IT support folks instead of logging into their computer and trying to figure out what's going on. If someone is coming to you and talking about their personal life a lot and it's really taking an emotional toll on you, you can recommend to them that they find a therapist. A boundary might be, I feel like I can't help you with this anymore. You really should seek professional help or talk to somebody else about it. For conversations about topics that may or may not be comfortable for you, pointing someone to a resource where they can have those conversations. In our work, we have lots of different Slack channels on various topics. And there's almost always a Slack channel for that, whatever topic it might be. So saying, here, go have that conversation here. I'm not comfortable having this anymore. I can't have this conversation with you anymore. So boundaries sound like I'm not the right audience for that comment. I can't sit with that. I'm not here for those type of interactions. That's a very clear, you start with an I statement. I'm not able to blah. I don't like it when blah. Boundaries look like walking away, not participating when you start feeling uncomfortable.
All right. We're heading into the part of the presentation that I think we're actually probably most excited about, sharing our experience. This will hopefully be an opportunity for learning from and supporting one another. We're going to take a few minutes for quiet reflection and writing. In whatever way works best for you, you can pull out a notepad and write, or you can capture information via your computer or mobile device. But we'd like to spend about 3 to 5 minutes on the following. Think of a time that you felt one of those signs of boundary violation. What triggered it? How did you cope? Think of a time that you successfully set or reset a boundary for yourself. What specific actions did you take? So we're going to paste those questions in the chat. You should be able to access, well, actually, you'll be able to access the chat regardless. We're going to go out into breakout sessions in a little bit. And that's in my head. I was like, oh, we got to put this in the chat so you're going to see it. But we're going to give you about a 1-minute warning, and then we're going to come back together in a few minutes. All right, so we're going to go ahead and mute, just take a couple minutes for these questions, and I'll go ahead and leave them up. My apologies, I forgot to give a 1-minute warning. So we've just got about 30 more seconds. All right. So I want to make sure we leave enough time here for our breakout session. I know we're kind of running out of time here, but real quick, can I get a couple of 1 or 2 word reactions to that exercise in the chat? All right, well, you'll have an opportunity here in the breakout room. We do have one person, Katie, shared growth, and we'll have an opportunity for you to just chat with each other here for a few minutes in the breakout room. Eleanor, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, so we're going to split up into breakout rooms for the rest of our time together. We're just going to come back right at 3:20 to do a very quick little wrap up. In your breakout room, please introduce yourself, and to the extent you feel comfortable, share something you just reflected on, either a time your boundary was crossed or a boundary setting experience you've had recently. Please identify to each other whether you prefer your group to simply listen or if you are open to hearing advice about the situation you're describing. I'm going to break you out into rooms now. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to pop out and we can put you back in. Well, thank you all so much. We did have a debrief planned, but we ran out of time, which is completely my fault. I just want to say thank you so much for your time and your trust and for everything you just shared in your breakout rooms. We did want to share our LinkedIn and our email addresses. You can search us on LinkedIn. For me, that's going to be Eleanor Hart, ELEANORHART. And for Michelle, that's going to be MJ Bromley. That's MJBROMLEY. We also have our email addresses posted up here and would really love to hear from anyone who wants to continue this conversation. Thank you all so much for coming.